100 Years of Japanese Film by Richie. Book review. So, when I was living in Japan, I at one point started to make an effort to learn more Japanese language and culture by watching a lot of Japanese movies. But I was going into the video store pretty blind. I didn't really have any idea of what were the good movies, what were the bad movies, what were the famous movies, what were the not famous movies. I liked old movies, but I didn't really have any way to organize them, and so I would just rent random stuff or rent stuff where the DVD art looked cool to me. And actually, you probably have been noticing that on this channel. I've been reviewing a lot of Japanese movies recently, but they're very random. I mean, all over the map, one from one year, one from another year. So, I was in a bookstore, and I saw this book, and I thought, oh, perfect. This will be my introduction to Japanese cinema, so I'm no longer going into the video store blind. The book is by Richie. And they praise him very generously on the cover jacket, which of course you have to take with a grain of salt because they always praise the author very generously on the cover jacket. But you do get the impression that he is single-handedly responsible for introducing Japanese cinema to the West. I mean, especially back in the day. He's one of the old boys, so way back in the 1960s and 70s, he was already writing about Japanese cinema. The introduction to the book is by none other than Paul Schrader. Paul Schrader is a famous Hollywood screenwriter. I think he's most famous for writing Taxi Driver and Raging Bull, Last Temptation of Jesus Christ, the screenplay, and a bunch of other stuff. He's quite famous in my hometown because he's from my hometown. So I was very familiar with that name. So Paul Schrader wrote the introduction to this book, and he claimed that in his own student days, again in the late 60s, early 70s, he was greatly influenced by Richie's other books on Japanese cinema. So he praised him very highly. Despite Schrader's high praise, though, I had a hard time making it through this book. So many names of directors and films are crammed into this 250-page book that it makes your head spin after a while. Some parts of the book are interesting, like when it talked about the filmmaking policies under the American occupation period. Or when it talked about the contrast between the American style of documentaries and the Japanese style of documentaries. But often, too often, it feels like you're just reading through a long list of films. There were many times when I considered just throwing this book against the wall and being done with it. And maybe I should have, to be honest. But I had this sense of obligation that I needed to finish this book for whatever reason, part of my Japanese studies. So I struggled through the whole thing, for better or for worse. I'm not quite sure it was worth it, to be honest. For people like me who are starting off with very little knowledge of Japanese cinema, there's a lot of information in this book. And there's no way to organize it. It's just lists of names and films, largely. Somebody who's already familiar with Japanese cinema and already has like a mental schemata with which to organize all this information might get more out of it. That being said, it would be an exaggeration to say I learned nothing from this book. I did pick up some useful facts. Helped me to understand Japanese style cinema more, and maybe will make me less critical in my reviews. For example, I'm always complaining in my reviews of Japanese films about the overacting. This book helped me understand that a bit more. It helped me realize that Japanese cinema has its own tradition and history separate from Western films and shouldn't be judged against the style of Western films. For example, the overacting. This is because Japanese view cinema as an outgrowth of the theater. So it's not supposed to be a realistic portrayal of how people act. It's supposed to be like you're going to the theater and you're watching something dramatic. Also, this book explains why Japanese TV and cinema can be repetitive. And it also explained to me an odd little quirk, which I've always been curious about living in Japan. Japanese audience in the cinema sit through the ending credits. So the film's over and there's that long list of ending credits. In Japan they just sit through that. I always found that odd. Oh, actually though, it's not that odd these days as it was 15 years ago. 15 years ago when I was living in Japan, I thought it was very odd. Nowadays, they have those, what do you call them? Extra scenes at the end of the credits. So nowadays, I guess it's more fashionable to sit through the credits now than it used to be 15 years ago. Anyways, point being, he talks about that habit in this book, where it comes from, why Japanese people do that. At the same time, there are things that he doesn't talk about, or at least he doesn't focus on. He focuses on all the great examples of Japanese cinema. What he overlooks is that in any given year, the Japanese movie industry cranks out a number of absolutely terrible films. A good book to look for on this is Dogs and Demons by Alexander Kerr, which is about many things, but one of the subjects he touches on is all the horrible films that are cranked out by the Japanese domestic cinema. Donald Richie acknowledges this in passing, but he chooses to focus on the films that are actually worth talking about. When I bought this book, I was hoping to use it as a guide in the video store. And although I'll certainly keep it around as a reference, the book contains very little information on any given film. To the extent that it talks about any one film, it's summed up in a couple sentences. Usually, the most he ever gives to any one film is a couple paragraphs. And this is what makes it so hard to read, is you never really get any information on any one film. It just talks about so many different films in such a short period. It feels like it's just listing films. There is, however, a small guide in the back, which has an index of films and like a brief couple sentence descriptions of them. And I think I will use that in the future when I try and navigate the video rental store. The book, to the extent that it has organization, is more or less organized around different directors. So it does give you a good understanding of the broad themes and approaches of different Japanese directors, even though it doesn't go into any one film that much. And it also talks about how the directors are different from each other. So in that respect, this book is going to be most useful. Although, again, for a novice like me, it's a little bit hard to keep track of. All these names of directors are thrown at me. And when I was done with the book, I don't really remember who did what or who had what style. It was just a bunch of strange names. That being said, a few of the movies that I have reviewed recently were mentioned in this book. Notably, My Neighbor Totoro, Shall We Dance, and Zatoichi. Now, I don't have a copy of the book with me at the moment, but if you Google image the title for this book, you'll see that the cover page is actually a shot of Zatoichi, which makes it surprising that Donald Richie gives Zatoichi a not great review. He says, quote, "Lots of violence, naturally, but at the same time a kind of noble pathos, which shortly becomes tiresome. The all-singing, tap-dancing finale is welcome, but rather too short." That's all the information he gives on Zatoichi, and then that gives you a flavor for the amount of depth you can expect from this book on any one film. But yeah, interesting that he does not seem to be a huge fan of that movie, and yet that's the cover picture for the book, is a shot from that movie. I'm guessing this is one of those cases where the publisher chose the cover and not the author. And around about the time that this book came out, I think it was the time that Zatoichi was really popular. So publishers probably thought they would sell more books with that cover. But yeah, it does not reflect what's actually written about Zatoichi inside the book. Now, lest I exaggerate my naivete with Japanese cinema, a number of other films I am familiar with were talked about in this book. Battle Royale, Godzilla, Rashomon, The Hidden Fortress, High and Low, Princess Mononoke, Howl's Moving Castle, Akira, Steam Boy, Ghost in the Shell, Brother, Tokyo Trial, etc. I have seen all those films actually, and some others that were mentioned in this book. I haven't reviewed them on this channel. I saw them all back in the day before I was regularly making reviews of movies. But those were more movies in the book that I was familiar with. There are some repetitive sections in this book. Same information repeated twice, sometimes almost the exact same sentence repeated twice, which are indicative that the proofreading was pretty sloppy on this. And somewhere along the way, someone was not giving this book a lot of attention as it was getting pushed out towards publication. Again, the fact that the cover of this book does not match the inside is another indication. Nevertheless, now that I've completed this book, I hope to use it as a reference in the future as I continue my journey into Japanese film. I don't know if I'd recommend this to anyone else, though. It's just not that interesting of a book. Interesting little addendum here. According to this book, there is an annual film festival in Yufuen, Oita Prefecture, Japan, which is actually right where I was living. I was living in Oita Prefecture. So it's interesting how you can live in a place for years and not know about this stuff, and then just read it in a book. But there you go, huh?